"I'm expecting your signature before Christmas," Claire whispered into Margaret Collins' ear as the family gathered around the long oak table for Thanksgiving dinner. The words were soft, almost lost beneath the clatter of silverware and the hum of polite conversation, but they landed with the weight of something far heavier. Margaret did not flinch. At 68, she had mastered the art of stillness. She kept her smile in place, steady and gracious, as she passed the bowl of mashed potatoes to her son Ethan, who avoided her eyes without seeming to realize he was doing it. The dining room looked exactly as it had for decades: polished wood floors, framed photographs lining the walls, the same brass chandelier casting warm light over familiar faces. Yet something in the air had shifted. Claire leaned back into her chair, her expression pleasant, her hand resting lightly on the folder tucked beside her purse. No one else seemed to notice. Laughter rose at the far end of the table, where cousins discussed football scores and travel plans, and the scent of roasted turkey and sage stuffing drifted through the house Margaret and her late husband had paid off 20 years earlier. 35 years of mortgage payments, scraped together from careful budgeting and second jobs, from Margaret's early mornings at the school district office and her husband's long evenings at the hardware store, had built this place into more than just square footage and resale value. It was 2,800 square feet of shared history. It was birthdays measured in height marks penciled along the kitchen doorway, Christmas mornings unwrapped beside the fireplace, and summers spent repainting the porch swing when the Texas heat cracked the old varnish. Margaret poured herself a small glass of iced tea and took a measured sip, her hands steady despite the sudden chill that had crept up her spine. She did not ask Claire what she meant. She did not need to. Over the past few months, she had noticed the subtle changes: the real estate brochures left on the kitchen counter by accident, Ethan's offhand comments about how a place this size must be hard to manage, Claire's gentle suggestions about senior communities with wonderful amenities. None of it had been confrontational. None of it loud. It had all been framed as concern. But concern does not usually come with paperwork. Margaret set her glass down carefully and reached for the gravy boat, her movements precise, deliberate. She watched Claire from the corner of her eye, saw the faint tightening around her daughter-in-law's smile, the flicker of expectation. Claire believed the moment had already been decided. She believed a whisper was enough to secure what decades of effort had built. Margaret felt something settle inside her then. Not anger, not even hurt, but clarity. Around her, the family continued eating, unaware that beneath the polite Thanksgiving rituals, a quiet negotiation for ownership had begun. Margaret lifted her chin slightly and met Claire's gaze across the table, her expression calm, almost warm. If Claire was expecting a signature, she would soon learn that Margaret Collins did not sign away her life simply because someone leaned close enough to murmur it. The rest of the evening unfolded with the kind of surface calm that only long-held tension can produce. Margaret remained at the head of the table, carving slices of pumpkin pie with steady hands while Ethan described a new project at his firm, and Claire nodded supportively at all the right moments. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen a close family sharing a holiday meal in a well-kept suburban home, a house with cream-colored walls and wide windows that looked out onto a yard Margaret had landscaped herself over the years. But Margaret heard every pause between words, every shift in tone. She noticed how Claire's purse never left her side, and how Ethan cleared his throat whenever conversation drifted toward finances or future plans. After dessert, while the younger cousins moved into the living room to watch football and the dishwasher hummed in the kitchen, Margaret gathered plates and carried them to the sink, declining offers of help with polite efficiency. She preferred the rhythm of washing and drying to the strain of small talk. Warm water ran over her hands as she replayed the whisper in her mind. Before Christmas. That gave her a timeline. Claire believed there was urgency, some advantage to securing a signature before the end of the year. Margaret dried the last plate and set it carefully in the cabinet that had held the same set of china since 1994, the year she and her husband celebrated their 25th anniversary. Back then, they had toasted to paying off the final 15 years of their mortgage ahead of schedule. They had promised each other that no matter what happened, the house would always remain a place of stability. Margaret felt that promise now like a steady pulse beneath her calm exterior. When the guests began putting on coats and gathering leftovers in foil-wrapped containers, Claire approached her again, this time with a softer expression. She spoke about simplifying life, about how large homes could become overwhelming, about communities where maintenance and landscaping were handled by professionals. Margaret listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, as if considering each point. She did not argue. She did not defend. She asked one simple question in return, her voice even. What exactly would my signature accomplish? Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second before explaining that transferring ownership to Ethan would make estate planning easier and protect everyone from future complications. Margaret absorbed the explanation without visible reaction. She thanked Claire for thinking ahead and said she would review any documents carefully when the time came. Claire seemed relieved by that answer, mistaking composure for agreement. Later that night, after the house fell quiet and the last car headlights disappeared down the street, Margaret stood alone in the living room. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. The framed photograph of her husband smiled back at her from its familiar place. She did not feel frightened. She felt alert. There was a difference. In the quiet, she understood something clearly. Concern can be offered with warmth, but entitlement arrives in whispers. And she intended to respond, not with emotion, but with preparation. The next morning Margaret woke before sunrise, as she always had, the house still wrapped in a thin layer of blue dawn light. She moved quietly through the kitchen, measuring coffee grounds with practiced precision and listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Routine steadied her thoughts. She carried her mug to the small desk by the window that overlooked the backyard, where frost edged the grass in a pale, silver sheen. The yard stretched out nearly half an acre, a space she and her husband had shaped together over decades, planting oak saplings that now towered above the fence line and lining the walkway with roses that still bloomed stubbornly even in late autumn. Margaret opened her laptop and began reviewing the household accounts, not because she doubted her own management, but because she wanted clarity. Every utility bill had been paid on time. Property taxes were current. The home insurance policy was active and renewed through the next year. There was no financial emergency. No hidden crisis that required urgency before Christmas. She clicked through past emails and found the message Claire had referenced weeks earlier, a polite suggestion about discussing estate planning. Attached was a draft document from a law office Margaret did not recognize. She read it slowly, line by line. The language was courteous, almost reassuring, but the implications were unmistakable. Transfer of deed. Immediate ownership change. Retained right of residence subject to mutual agreement. Margaret closed the document and sat back in her chair. Mutual agreement. That phrase lingered in her mind. It sounded cooperative, yet it quietly shifted control. If ownership changed hands, so did leverage. She thought of Ethan as a little boy running through this same backyard, chasing fireflies on humid summer evenings, his laughter echoing against the wooden fence. She had never imagined needing to protect herself from her own child. Yet protection did not always mean confrontation. Sometimes it meant preparation. Margaret reached for the leather-bound folder where she kept copies of her will and trust documents, last updated 5 years earlier after her husband passed away from heart failure. He had insisted they keep everything straightforward. The house in her name. The savings divided evenly. Clear instructions, no ambiguity. She flipped through the pages carefully, noting the clauses and contingencies. Nothing required immediate change, but nothing prevented revision either. The law, she knew, was not emotional. It followed signatures and dates. Later that afternoon, she drove her silver sedan to the bank downtown, a branch she had used for more than 20 years. She greeted the teller by name and requested a meeting with the financial advisor she trusted. She did not mention whispers or Thanksgiving conversations. She simply said she wanted to review her assets and confirm her options. As she left the building with a folder of updated statements tucked neatly in her purse, Margaret felt something settle more firmly within her. Claire believed urgency would pressure her into compliance. But Margaret understood something Claire did not. Time favors the person who remains calm. And she had no intention of being hurried into surrendering the only place that had ever truly been hers. 2 days later Margaret received a call from Claire, her voice bright and carefully composed, suggesting they meet for lunch at a cafe near the shopping center about 5 miles from the house. Margaret agreed without hesitation. She chose a navy wool coat and drove through the late November chill, watching bare tree branches sway against a pale sky. The cafe was warm and softly lit, the kind of place where conversations could be mistaken for friendly chatter even when they carried sharper edges. Claire was already seated at a corner table, a leather folder resting neatly beside her latte. She stood to greet Margaret with a brief embrace that felt more rehearsed than affectionate. They ordered soup and sandwiches, and for several minutes the discussion remained comfortably neutral. Weather, holiday sales, plans for Christmas decorations. Margaret noticed how Claire's hand remained close to the folder, her fingers occasionally brushing its edge as if reassuring herself it was still there. Eventually Claire drew a steady breath and slid the folder across the table. Inside were updated documents, printed cleanly, tabs marking places where signatures were required. She explained that transferring ownership now would simplify future arrangements, protect everyone from probate complications, and ensure that Ethan would not face unexpected burdens later. The language was calm, practical, almost generous. Margaret listened, her expression thoughtful, as though weighing a reasonable proposal. She asked a few measured questions about timelines and contingencies, never raising her voice, never revealing the careful review she had already conducted. Claire spoke with increasing confidence, interpreting Margaret's silence as agreement rather than calculation. The cafe's soft music filled brief pauses, and sunlight filtered through the front window, casting faint reflections across the polished table surface. Margaret turned each page slowly, reading every clause with deliberate care. Transfer of deed. Immediate recording with the county clerk. Shared occupancy until mutually agreed relocation. That phrase appeared again. Mutually agreed. Margaret set the papers down gently and folded her hands. She thanked Claire for the effort involved in preparing the documents, and said she preferred to have her own attorney review them before signing anything. The change in Claire's posture was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, and her smile tightened at the corners. She assured Margaret that the paperwork was standard, that there was no need for additional expense or delay. Margaret responded evenly that clarity was never an unnecessary expense. She reached for her purse and placed the documents inside, promising to return them after consultation. Outside, as they parted in the parking lot, Claire's tone remained cordial, yet there was an urgency beneath it that Margaret recognized clearly now. Driving home, Margaret felt no surge of triumph, only a growing certainty. The attempt was no longer hidden behind casual conversation. It had moved into printed form. Ink and signature lines. Deadlines implied, but not spoken. When she pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine, she sat for a moment in the quiet car, looking at the familiar brick exterior and the wreath still hanging on the front door. This house was not a burden to manage. It was a foundation, and foundations are not surrendered because someone suggests it would be convenient. Margaret did not delay. The following morning she scheduled an appointment with Helen Brooks, a longtime friend and retired estate attorney who now worked part-time as a legal consultant. Helen's office was modest but orderly, located in a brick building just off Main Street, less than 10 miles from Margaret's home. The reception area smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and framed certificates lined the walls in quiet testimony to decades of experience. When Margaret laid the folder of documents on Helen's desk, she did so without commentary. She allowed the pages to speak for themselves. Helen adjusted her reading glasses and began reviewing the transfer agreement in silence. The ticking of a small desk clock filled the room while Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, her expression composed. She did not dramatize the situation. She did not describe whispers or tense lunches. She simply said she wanted to understand every consequence before making any decision. Helen read each clause carefully, her brow tightening slightly as she moved through the sections detailing ownership transfer and retained occupancy. After several minutes, she closed the folder and met Margaret's eyes. The structure, she explained, would grant Ethan full legal ownership immediately. Margaret would retain the right to reside in the property, but that right could be negotiated, amended, or indirectly limited depending on future circumstances. If the home were refinanced or leveraged, Margaret would have no controlling authority. If disagreements arose, legal standing would favor the deed holder. Helen's tone remained calm, factual, without embellishment. Margaret listened without visible reaction. She asked whether alternatives existed that would protect her interests while still ensuring clarity for the future. Helen nodded and began outlining options. A revocable living trust could maintain Margaret's control while simplifying eventual transfer. An irrevocable trust could protect the property from outside influence and define precise terms for inheritance. There were ways to provide stability without surrendering authority. Margaret felt a quiet steadiness return as the conversation shifted from vulnerability to strategy. She authorized Helen to draft revised documents placing the house into a trust under Margaret's sole control, with explicit provisions that any future transfer would occur only under clearly defined conditions. She also requested an updated will reflecting charitable allocations to a local scholarship fund, a gesture her late husband had once mentioned during a conversation about legacy. Helen made notes, her pen moving decisively across a legal pad. By the time Margaret left the office, she carried not just papers but direction. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as she walked to her car. She did not feel triumphant. She felt prepared. Claire believed urgency created leverage. Margaret understood that knowledge created protection. The difference between pressure and power often rests on who signs first. And Margaret Collins had no intention of being the first to surrender control of the life she and her husband had built. By the end of the week, the revised documents were ready. Helen called to confirm that the trust paperwork had been filed with the county and recorded properly, ensuring that the house now rested under a legal structure that Margaret alone controlled. There would be no quiet transfer. No convenient shift of authority hidden behind polite explanations. When Margaret hung up the phone, she stood for a moment in the center of her living room and allowed herself a slow breath. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the hardwood floors her husband had refinished himself one summer nearly 20 years ago. Nothing about the house looked different. That was the point. Protection did not need to be visible to be effective. Later that evening Ethan called, his voice casual at first, asking whether she had reviewed the paperwork Claire had provided. Margaret answered evenly that she had consulted her attorney and updated her estate plan accordingly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a brief silence that carried more meaning than words. Ethan asked what she meant. Margaret explained that the house had been placed into a trust designed to preserve stability and prevent confusion in the future. She spoke without accusation, without raised emotion. She simply stated facts. Ethan's tone shifted, not confrontational but unsettled. He said they were only trying to help, that they worried about maintenance and long-term planning. Margaret replied that she appreciated concern, but long-term planning required her participation, not her removal. She did not elaborate. She did not defend further. After the call ended, she returned to the kitchen and prepared a simple dinner, the steady rhythm of chopping vegetables grounding her thoughts. The phone remained silent for the rest of the night. The following Sunday, Ethan and Claire arrived unannounced in the late afternoon. Margaret welcomed them inside with the same composure she had always shown. Claire's smile was thinner now, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for evidence of change. They sat in the living room, sunlight casting long shadows across the rug. Ethan spoke first, asking why she had not discussed her decision before making it official. Margaret answered that decisions concerning her property required her initiative, not permission. Claire attempted to reframe the conversation, suggesting that trust structures could complicate matters and that shared ownership would have simplified everything. Margaret listened without interruption. Then she reached for a neatly organized folder on the coffee table and handed them a summary prepared by Helen outlining the protections now in place. It detailed clear succession terms, charitable allocations, and specific conditions under which the property could ever change hands. There was no ambiguity left to negotiate. Claire read silently, her expression tightening with each page. Ethan shifted in his seat, absorbing the reality that the anticipated signature would not come. Margaret remained calm, her posture straight, her voice steady when she finally spoke. Stability, she said, begins with boundaries. And boundaries, once defined, do not require explanation. The room felt smaller after the documents had been read. Not physically smaller, but altered, as though the air itself had adjusted to a new understanding. Claire placed the summary back into the folder with careful precision, smoothing the edges as if the paper might rearrange itself if handled gently enough. Ethan leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the rug beneath the coffee table. Margaret observed them, both without hostility. She did not feel anger rising. She felt distance. A clear, measured distance that allowed her to see the situation without blur. Claire spoke first, her tone controlled but strained, suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that their intentions had only been to ensure that Margaret would not face unexpected burdens. Margaret listened, then asked one quiet question. If the intention was protection, why was ownership the solution? The question settled between them. Claire attempted to explain that shared ownership would have simplified decisions if Margaret ever needed assistance. Margaret replied that assistance does not require surrender. She spoke gently, yet her words carried the weight of finality. Ethan finally looked up and asked whether she no longer trusted them. Margaret did not rush her answer. Trust, she said, is not measured by signatures. It is measured by respect. She explained that decisions about her home required conversation, not persuasion. The house was not an inconvenience to be reassigned. It was the foundation of her independence. Claire's composure began to thin, not through raised voices but through subtle shifts. Her posture stiffened. Her smile no longer reached her eyes. She asked whether the charitable allocation in the trust was necessary. Margaret answered that legacy is defined by choice, not expectation. The scholarship fund had been something her late husband believed in. Supporting it felt right. Silence followed. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking seconds that seemed longer than usual. Outside, a car passed down the street, its engine fading into the distance. Inside, the power dynamic had shifted completely. Margaret was no longer responding to a proposal. She was defining the terms of her own future. Claire closed her purse with deliberate care and stood, thanking Margaret for her time in a voice that carried more restraint than warmth. Ethan rose more slowly, lingering for a moment as if searching for words that would restore familiarity. None came. Margaret walked them to the door with the same courtesy she had always extended. When the door closed behind them, the house returned to its quiet rhythm. Margaret did not feel victorious. She felt settled. Boundaries had been drawn without spectacle. Authority had been preserved without hostility. She moved back into the living room and adjusted a framed photograph on the mantel, straightening it slightly. Control, she understood now, does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself in calm decisions made before others realize the choice was never theirs to begin with. The week that followed unfolded with an unfamiliar quiet. Ethan did not call. Claire did not send reminders. The absence of pressure felt deliberate, as though silence itself had become a strategy. Margaret continued her routines without deviation. She drove to the grocery store on Tuesday morning, selecting fresh produce and greeting neighbors in the produce aisle. She attended her Thursday book club at the community library, listening more than she spoke, her posture composed, her thoughts measured. Nothing about her outward life suggested disruption. Yet beneath the calm rhythm of errands and familiar conversations, she sensed a recalibration within her family. On Saturday afternoon, Ethan arrived alone. He stood on the front porch longer than usual before ringing the bell, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Margaret opened the door with the same steady expression she had worn all week. She invited him inside and offered coffee. He declined the coffee but accepted a seat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had once done homework under her supervision, where science fair projects had been assembled and college applications completed. For several moments he said nothing. Then he admitted that he had not fully understood the implications of the paperwork Claire had prepared. He had trusted that everything was practical, responsible. Margaret listened without interrupting. She did not accuse Claire. She did not assign blame. She simply explained that responsibility begins with transparency. If they had approached her openly, without assumptions about urgency or control, the conversation might have unfolded differently. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that truth. He asked whether the trust could ever include him in the future. Margaret answered carefully. The trust was designed to protect stability. Inclusion was possible, but only through respect and mutual clarity. It was not a reward to be negotiated under pressure. It was something earned through trust rebuilt over time. Ethan's shoulders eased slightly, as though the conversation had shifted from confrontation to possibility. When he left later that afternoon, He hugged her longer than he had in months. The gesture felt genuine, uncertain but sincere. Margaret closed the door and stood for a moment in the quiet hallway. She understood that control had never truly been about documents alone. It had been about influence, about who defined the narrative of what was necessary and who was capable. By placing the house into a trust, she had not only protected property, she had restored balance. Outside, the winter sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden light across the yard. Margaret adjusted the thermostat and straightened a stack of mail on the counter. The house remained hers, not simply by law, but by decision. And decisions made calmly carry a strength that no whisper can overturn. December arrived quietly, carrying with it the kind of crisp mornings that made the air feel sharper and the sky seem higher. Margaret woke before sunrise as usual, stepping into the kitchen where soft light from the under-cabinet fixtures reflected against polished countertops. The house felt settled, grounded in a way it had not weeks earlier. The tension that once hovered in whispers had dissolved into something clearer. Not warmth, not yet, but understanding. A few days before Christmas, Ethan and Claire came by together. This time there was no folder in Claire's hand, no rehearsed proposal waiting to be unfolded. They brought a small box of pastries from a bakery downtown and stood side by side on the porch, their expressions composed but subdued. Margaret invited them inside. The living room glowed with white string lights wrapped around the banister and a modest evergreen tree placed near the front window. The ornaments were familiar, collected over decades, each carrying a quiet memory. They sat together, the three of them, without immediate agenda. Claire spoke first. Her voice was measured, no longer edged with urgency. She acknowledged that perhaps they had moved too quickly, that what felt practical to them had overlooked the importance of Margaret's autonomy. The apology was not dramatic. It was restrained, almost formal, yet it held sincerity. Margaret listened carefully, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She did not rush to reassure them. She allowed the moment to exist as it was. Ethan added that he should have asked more questions, that he should have understood the implications before assuming agreement. Margaret met his gaze and nodded. Growth, she knew, rarely arrives in comfort. It often follows miscalculation. She explained that her decisions were not punishments. They were protections. The trust would remain. The structure would not change. But trust within the family could be rebuilt through transparency, not assumption. Claire exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing as if a negotiation had quietly concluded. Outside, snow began to fall in soft, deliberate flakes, settling across the lawn in a thin white layer. The conversation shifted naturally after that, moving toward holiday plans and shared meals. Nothing was exaggerated, nothing overly sentimental. It was steady, real. When they left later that afternoon, Margaret stood at the window and watched their car pull away. She did not feel triumph. She felt balance restored. The house stood firm behind her, its walls holding decades of patience, resilience, and deliberate choice. Control had not required raised voices or shattered relationships. It had required clarity. Margaret turned from the window and adjusted an ornament on the tree, aligning it carefully among the others. Legacy, she understood now, is not about who expects a signature. It is about who respects the hand that holds the pen.